People refer to the decade of the 60s as a time of change. Personally, I feel like the last 6 months has felt like a decade kind of crammed into just that short period of time. If you can wind your clock back at the start of this year, at the end of last year as well, there was those fires that ravaged our state. And they provoke different ideas in our society about how we care for one another, how we look after our environment, how we plan for the future and help to combine as a community to support people in difficult times. Of course, in March, when COVID-19 struck and the pandemic was expressed into this state of disaster across our nation and across our state, it's provoked even more different types of thinking within ourselves as well, hasn't it? So we continue to ask questions about what's really important during this time. How do we balance the health of the economy and the health of people? How do we process and deal with these difficult questions in this time of life? In the past 6 weeks, racial tensions as well now have exploded across our world. I think in many ways they were obviously bubbling beneath the surface, and now they've just risen up and just gone boom. The death of George Floyd obviously ignited a slumbering powder keg of this suppressed anger and hurt. And in response, we've seen people campaigning, people rioting, people protesting, all for human rights. For human rights. What are human rights? At the heart of the Western world's understanding of human rights, of the idea of human dignity, is this fundamental Christian belief. From the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, it declares this: God said, "Let us make human beings in our image to be like us." The biblical book of Genesis describes in the creation account an understanding of God and humanity that impacts our world in significant ways today. And at the heart of that is this central belief that all humans are made in the image of God, or you may have seen the Latin, the Imago Dei expression of that. But what does it mean to be made in the image of God? It's obviously not referring to physical likeness. We do not look like God. God is spirit. We are physical matter. Maybe sometimes we think it's like personality. You're just like your mother. You're just like your father. You have the same interests, maybe the same types of personality or character. Now, without going into greater detail, maybe that's one for a little bit later down the journey this year, the following are kind of a short summary of areas that are considered to be an important part of what it means to be made in the image of God. The first one is cognition. And what that simply means is we can think. Humans have the ability to reason, to be able to have rational thought and understanding. And so we express this in mathematics and science and language and laughter and emotions and caring and empathy and cultural products like music and art. And in many of these key dimensions, particularly the social realm, we see how humans are different than all other creatures. That's considered part of what it means to be made in the image of God. The second aspect that we might see very simply is this, is spiritual capacity, an ability for humans to have a relationship with God. The theologian Thomas Aquinas put it this way. He said, "Of all visible creatures, only man is able to know and love his Creator. He alone is called to share by knowledge and love in God's own life. It was for this end that he was created, and this is the fundamental reason for his dignity. Being in the image of God, the human individual possesses the dignity of a person who is not just something, but someone, capable of self-knowledge, of self-possession, and of freely giving himself and entering into communion with other persons, and is called by grace to a covenant with his Creator to offer him a response of faith and love that no other creature can give in his stead." And so is this a part of what it means to be made in the image of God? A human spiritual capacity to enter into a relationship with God is a significant part of what that means. The third thing we might say is part of the image of God in a human being is that they have the ability to participate in the mission of God. This is not so much about who a person is, but rather why they are. Because humans are called to live as God's representatives in the world, God has named us his living images. We represent God on earth better than any other idol or object made by human hands. The theologian Tom Wright puts it this way: it seems to me that God has put humans like an angled mirror in his world so that God can reflect his love and care and stewardship of the world through humans, and so that the rest of the world can praise the Creator through humans. And so in a very short way, we can see that to be part of the image of God is not just our cognitive abilities, and not just our spiritual capacity for a relationship with God, but also this participating in the mission of God. And in truth, it's probably a number of those different elements together of what that means. But when we think about them together, it has this fundamental application, this foundational belief of being made in the image of God, says that all humans are intrinsically important because humans are made in the image of God. So all lives matter. Every human is loved by God with a redemptive love. When Jesus tells the story, the parable about the shepherd who has 99 sheep safely tucked away in a pen, and he realizes that one is missing and he goes searching for the one, that is a practical expression that each individual is of important worth and value. That you would leave the 99 to search for the one because they are important and loved. So every human has inherent dignity and value. Our worth is not determined by our achievement. And so that implies that we need to see all people, every single person, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their gender, who they are, how they worship, as they are all full image bearers of God. And that truth undermines any human attempt to build barriers or divisions between groups. You know, I want to say to you today that in many ways that's a simple truth for me to declare here. And I feel confident that for the vast majority of people who want to follow Jesus will agree with that truth. Today I want to say that's the easy part, because what that looks like in day-to-day life is often harder, because belief must lead to behaviour. And what we understand must be worked out through our hands. And the truth is, in the life of the Christian church, we see that fundamental belief find expression in many ways. Throughout the Old and New Testament parts of the Bible, they're very clear about how all people are to be treated. The focus is particularly on the vulnerable and those who are unable to speak or defend themselves. So it starts with how we look after the refugee, the orphan, the widow. And it's extended through the history of the Christian church to the sick, the disabled, the aged, the ostracised. In fact, it's no exaggeration at all to say that this basic Western idea of looking after every single individual is distinctly Christian. But one of the areas that I believe the Christian church has struggled with is in the area of race relations. At times, anti-Semitism has been part of the Christian church. Slavery in the past as well. And now in this present, in our current time, we see the church amongst other organisations and parts of our society wrestling with race relations. How do we apply this? How do we think that we should live this out? You know, in Australia, it is clearly true that if you are born Indigenous, it is a massive setback to the start of your life. In the USA, they have a saying about people who are born on third base believe that they've hit a triple in their life. Well, if you are born in Australia as an Indigenous person, it's clear that you start a long way behind the starting line of other people in life. That's a terrible situation. But like me, maybe you struggle to know how we should proceed in this situation. You observe what goes on in the world, you observe what goes on in our nation, and you struggle. We've looked across the Pacific in the events of the US at both the protests and the riots, and we've said, wow, that's amazing. That's unfair. That's fair. I understand. I don't understand. We say, do all lives matter or only black lives matter? I'm glad Australia's not like that. And yet we see footballers kneel down at the start of a match. We see campaigns rising up about black deaths in custody, about Indigenous deaths in custody. And we ask ourselves, how do we respond? I mean, Andrew, I hear you say this, well, all lives matter and all black lives matter. But you know what? I agree with some parts of that movement, but I can't agree with all parts of that movement. There are parts of the political campaign, parts of it which are clearly against what the Word of God is about. And so I can't align myself with that. And we see ourselves where we say, you know what? Yes, people in this area are hurting, but what about people in this area? And so we start to engage in whataboutism. We say in Australia, isn't it confusing how to deal with this? I mean, if you've read the Uluru Statement, an important statement a couple of years ago, it calls for a treaty, but yet we see Indigenous leaders don't even seem to be on the same page themselves. So how are we meant to respond? 5 years ago, my family and I travelled around Australia, and we had the opportunity at sometimes to be in some local Indigenous centres. And I remember clearly at one place, a dance, art and craft festival, we listened to artists share about their experience of the hurt and the anger, and there were expressions of that pain. And at the end of it, when Narelle and I walked away and we would talk to each other, we were left wondering if there was any answers at all. And maybe you felt that way, and so we sort of feel like, well, we're just going to throw our hands in the air, it's too difficult. Maybe we just do nothing. But my problem is this, is that I can't just ignore the pain that goes on in that world. It calls me to do something different. Listen to this heartfelt paragraph from the Uluru Statement, talking about our own Indigenous people, our First Nations people here in Australia. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. But we are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers, and they should be our hope for the future. Every year, the Closing the Gap reports on the well-being of our Indigenous peoples. And again, it expresses the poor results, highlights systemic and embedded problems. You know, racism can be overt and individual from one person to another, but it can also be structural, as social institutions perpetuate some of the problems that are part of it. You know, these systemic issues that exist within Australia, to me, say that we cannot just simply ostrich the issue. We can't just simply stick our head in the sand and pretend that it's going to work itself out and be better. I don't always know the answer about how we to respond, but I sense that we do need to respond in some way. I thought, as part of that, rather than me try to propose any ideas with my limited understanding, was that I would engage some other people who have different experience and insights of some of those issues. So please listen along.
Yeah, so I grew up here in Melbourne, actually in Glen Waverley, so not too far from here, and gave my life to Christ when I was nearly 22. And the school I went to was a little multicultural, but it was mostly upper middle class white. Heard about a short-term mission trip to PNG, to Papua New Guinea for 2 years. And anyway, the short of the story was that God orchestrated that and put that together. And that was the 2 years in Papua New Guinea when I was 25, 26. That was totally life-changing.
And so not only did you spend that 2 years in PNG, you spent follow-up, obviously, a number of considerable many years. About how much time did you spend overall in PNG?
I think overall in Papua New Guinea we spent probably about 16 years or so working in remote communities.
And so being there for that length of time, how did you find the balance between feeling like you fit in and then other times you didn't fit in?
over time felt more and more that really fitted in with the local people, and at times actually forgot that my skin colour.
That cultural identity must take time and understanding.
It takes a lot of time, a lot of understanding, and a willingness to learn. I found a willingness for me to put to the side the things that I thought were perhaps the most important. And I had to be willing to really change what my kind of, in a sense, my worldview on what makes for a good life in that situation. It really is a process, and it comes from just really getting to know people and loving them and doing life together. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been back in Australia now for how many years?
We've been back nearly 5 years now. Yeah.
It's quite a long period of time. And during that time, just for what's the role that you've been engaged in?
Okay, since returning back, working as an arts and cultural consultant with Wycliffe Australia.
Help me to understand from a layman's perspective, arts and cultural things. What does that mean for some average Joe like myself?
All right, so it's about learning about the cultures and about the artistic languages and expressions used by different cultures, and just acknowledging that what we see as artistic and the way we communicate creatively isn't going to be the same as another culture, as another people group.
So how have you found that when you've been into Indigenous communities in Central Australia? How have you found that?
I've found it incredibly rich, incredibly diverse. I'm a painter by background, and one of the main modes of artistic communication amongst communities in Central Australia is actually painting. And that's been a really interesting and really, I think, deeper connecting point with artists and communities, that we've got that commonality. Yeah.
So what would you say to kind of us, the average person who haven't spent that extended period of times in those communities?
I think some of the critical learning kind of aspects have been that there is no right or wrong. People are just different. And we think about things differently, we express them differently, but at the heart, we're still God's people, and that we are all equal in God's eyes.
Trying to communicate and understand. One of the things that I know personally I find frustrating, and from what I hear from others, is how do we as the church participate in improving the well-being of Indigenous communities? Now, for someone who's spent time in that places, what do you think are the most critical things?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. Listening is a huge, huge part, is listening and willing to understand, I think, where people are coming from and why people are where they're at in senses of powerlessness and I think rather than providing an aid program, I think maybe being willing to really listen and to hear and to take on board that maybe what our understanding perhaps isn't the full picture, and maybe isn't even the picture of what our Indigenous people have really gone through.
I'm excited to interview Brooke Prentice. Brooke is the CEO of Common Grace, which is a movement of Christians who are passionate about Jesus and social justice issues.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be with everyone in this virtual way. I'm an Aboriginal Christian leader. My peoples are the Waka Waka peoples. And so that's in the area now called Southeast Queensland. And Waka Waka Nation is about 3 hours drive northwest of the place now called Brisbane or Meanjin. But I was born up in far north Queensland on the land of the Indigenous peoples and have lived most of my life and grown up on southern Gubbi country, which is the Sunshine Coast area of Queensland, which is the neighbouring nation to Waka Waka Nation. But I now live here on the lands of the Gadigal peoples in the place now called Sydney. And so this is usually how an Aboriginal person will introduce themselves with all the different areas that mean something to us. And I guess it's a way of helping to bring people into the journey about these lands now called Australia, and now over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia. And that we've been custodians, caretakers and stewards of these lands and waters as appointed by the Creator since time immemorial. And so that's a huge part of my story. But I didn't become a Christian until the age of 21, and that was in the Salvation Army. And so I heard the stories of William and Catherine Booth and were inspired by their stories. I heard the story of Jesus and was inspired by Jesus, and came to faith in November 2001 at the age of 21. I'm a chartered accountant by profession, one of only 22 Indigenous chartered accountants in all of Australia. I worked for 7 years for Ernst & Young, which is one of the big four accounting firms internationally. And then Jesus had a very strong pull on my life to I actually left accounting to go and run the Salvation Army's only Aboriginal church in Australia, which was in Ipswich, 30 minutes west of Brisbane. And I guess 2012 is when my ecumenical world opened up. Sadly, the Salvation Army closed down the Aboriginal church, and so that's when I started working interdenominationally and ecumenically. I dream of an Australia that's built on truth and justice and love and hope. And that we can build that together as friends, as Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal peoples.
I'm wondering why you can share with us about why this is so important, not only to you as an Indigenous woman, but also to the Indigenous community and to the broader Australian community.
Yeah, well, it's actually 90% of Australians don't know an Aboriginal person. And I wonder, for those listening today, how many Aboriginal people you might know. And then if you do know Aboriginal people, are you friends with Aboriginal people? And so I guess the other thing is, as Christians, you know, we do have the language of reconciliation. Obviously, in Australia, it means something very specific, being the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal peoples. And that's been a 250-year relationship if we go back to Cook coming on the 29th of April, 1770 to Kurnell. But we have to actually go past that, and that as Aboriginal peoples, we are part of God's story. The Creator placed us here in these lands as His custodian. And when we look at that history of the last 250 years, there's still a lot of truth telling that needs to be told about what's happened and how we find ourselves in the place that we find ourselves today as Aboriginal peoples, but also as non-Aboriginal peoples. As Auntie Jean Phillips says, your history is our history is your history. That's a shared history of the last 250 years. But when you actually look at some of the impacts of colonisation and what has happened to Aboriginal peoples, stolen generations, stolen wages. Some people might not have heard of stolen wages before, and that's you can start by looking at Dr. Ros Kidd's incredible work. Aboriginal people were paid in tea, sugar, flour, right up until the 1960s, doing very hard labour from the age of 10 years old. And so that's something that has impacts today. Like, you know, if you're paid in tea, sugar, flour up until the late 1960s, what do you think some of the health outcomes might be? And that's why today we talk about closing the gap. We're still here and we're still part of God's story. And our deep sense is, it's our deep cultural values, but most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are actually Christian. but you won't often find us in the church. And that's something that we still need to work together. And I guess where Common Grace is playing a leading role to amplify the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christian leaders and show the incredible ministries that we've been a part of, and the incredible fact that our Christian faith, as well as our Aboriginal culture, founding principles are hospitality and generosity. And so those words I used before of friendship are central to who we are as peoples and our call as Christians. And so that love for Jesus that extends to all peoples.
I'm wondering if you can help our community understand, what does it feel like to be, first of all, identify as an Indigenous person, as a First Nations person, or what does it feel like to feel like you're oppressed?
Yeah, it's a hard one, and it's a very emotional one, and I guess that's why that call for friendship is there, to actually come and journey with us, because as friends you share your joys and your hopes and your celebrations, but also the things that are hard, and the sadness and the grief. And people might look at me and go, oh, you've got fair skin, what do you know about racism? But what often happens is that because people don't immediately think that I'm Aboriginal, you'll actually hear their true heart. And so, you know, racism is real in this country. It's been real since 1770. And, you know, before, if you want to put a time frame on, if we look at the last kind of 8 weeks in light of the global Black Lives Matter movement, before that, Reconciliation Australia did the research, and it was proof in my life that on average we'd experience racism 3 times a week as Aboriginal peoples. At the moment, I'm experiencing racism up to 20 times a day on social media. People seem to have got courage to say things that are racist, and that breaks my heart, because that's not what I want for me. It's not what I want for anyone. My people still today are 6 times more likely to die from diabetes. We're going to funerals for people who've died from diabetes. Diabetes is a huge problem, and it affects every single one of us. You know, we've just come out of National Homelessness Week. On census night in 2011, 1 in 20 Aboriginal people were homeless. And so these are our friends and our family who we're trying to help, and particularly as Aboriginal Christian leaders, we're trying to organise the funerals with our people who are dying 11 to 17 years younger than the non-Indigenous population. As Stan Grant said, my people die too young and too often. And that's our lived reality. We know that your community can't be whole unless everyone is supported. And we get that as Aboriginal peoples. And I guess that's what my dream is, of that Australia built on truth, justice, love, and hope, that we come together in community, that we understand, that we grieve with our brothers and sisters, that we celebrate with our brothers and sisters, but that we're there for each other. It's that love where one lays down their life for their brother and sister.
You mentioned earlier on, Brooke, that as a 17-year-old, you had this hope and optimism about the timing for reconciliation and other elements of Indigenous life. What would your hope be for the Christian church to help to make a difference within the Indigenous community?
Yeah, my hope and my prayer every day is that Christians become involved. That it's because you might never meet Aboriginal people, but to understand what is happening, and that as Christians, and we're an important part of society, but in issues of being friends with Aboriginal people, often Christians are lagging behind the rest of society. And so when we come together using the common grace kind of language, when we come together for the common good and sharing, finding that common ground and sharing in that common grace, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples need that more than ever. And for me, the church and Christians should be that place where we have that shared understanding of love. And that needs to ripple throughout society. And so to become involved, whether that's, you know, really starting with listening and with learning, and then what is Jesus doing in your heart and what skills and giftings do you have? What can you do in your own strength to bring about some sort of action for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for justice?
I'm just wondering if there's any other things that are particularly close to your heart that you'd like to share with us today, Brooke.
I do pray for each and every one listening that there will just be that one person who might have that change of heart. You know, when I first started out in this journey and coming alongside Auntie Jean Phillips, you know, she's been in ministry for 60 years, still over 80, doing full-time ministry, distributing food parcels to Aboriginal peoples in our community, organising funerals, helping people buy fridges, helping people find homes. You know, that's what we're doing each and every day. And while she's an incredible leader at 80 years of age, I want others to come on the journey to help her. But when I came on the journey with her, I'm like, oh, we just need to educate all these Christians. They don't know who Aboriginal peoples are and what has happened in Australia over these 250 years and what's happening today. And what I realized is I've done so much educating, and it wasn't just me, it's the elders and leaders that have gone before me. But it's actually about our change of heart. And it's Jesus that transforms our lives. And I'm so grateful that Jesus is a part of my life and that I walk with him each and every day through all of these situations. And even though I see much injustice and much hurt and much grief, there is still hope. And so I hope that people hear that message of hope. And whilst pay attention to what's happening in your heart, what I can afford is for you to come and simply sit with us, to be friends with us. And what I say is, let's sit together in our pain. Let's stand together against injustice. Let's walk together in truth and friendship. And let's pray together for change. And that Jesus unsettles me each and every day. I think it's part of what it means to be on that journey with Jesus as a Christian. And so whatever feelings you have, to think about it, that Jesus is unsettling your heart and your mind and your whole being, and to tune into that and take some of those steps to sit, to stand, to walk, to pray, and let's see what we might be able to do together.
You know, I was chatting about this topic with Leah the other day, and she asked me this question. She said, Andrew, what's the takeaway? How should I respond? Well, I want to say to you that I've wrestled with this topic a lot in how to present it today, and in many ways it's been very difficult, especially because we're doing it digitally. We're robbed of that shared experience of learning it together because we're distant. But I imagine that as we've listened today, some of our reactions vary. For some of us, we feel guilty. For some of us, maybe we feel shame. For others, maybe it's anger. For others, it's maybe interest or you're enthusiastic about it. Now, I want to ask you this. Will you participate in this? Will you be open to listen, as Brooke said, to search your heart? I would ask you that would you be willing to learn something more? It might be to read or to watch, and there's some more details that are available on the screen right now, or you can get them off our website. Would you be prepared to engage? I do know this, that in the history of Croydon Hills Baptist Church, there are a couple of very significant moments that should help us understand. In 2006, a small number of Karen families, refugees from Burma, began to worship here. You know, I suspect up until that moment, not many of us had ever rubbed shoulders with a refugee. But now, we know them. We share a meal. We dance together. We kick a football. We sing together. It changes our attitudes. It gives us an empathy and understanding, doesn't it? 3 years ago, we began our winter shelter program to help house homeless men. Again, I suspect that up until that point in time, not many of us knew a homeless man. Probably many of us found it too easy to categorise them as, oh, they're the ne'er-do-wells in life. Drug addict, criminal, you take your pick. But once we share a meal, enjoy a conversation, listen, we begin to hear the story and our attitudes change. Our heart is moved. Our empathy grows. You see, when we engage with people, it helps us to seek to understand, doesn't it? We begin to see them as God would see them. And we ask ourselves, what are those elements that we see of God in that person? It causes us to love them. So I want to say to you in how we respond, the answers are not simple. That would be kind of trying to provide a 20-cent answer to $1 million question. But our first steps, I believe, need to be that we begin to listen, to learn, and engage and take action. And so I'm inviting you to do that. I'm inviting you to do it because of this truth, that every human is created by God and every human is loved by God.